What if an entire city was built on poison, thrived for decades, and only later did the world realize that its success came at the cost of silent contamination? In the heart of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest and most hostile places on Earth, Humberstone rose as a symbol of progress, discipline, and industrial power. From a distance, it looked like a miracle, a fully functioning town where nothing should have survived. But beneath its order, its schools, its theaters, and its neatly painted houses, something far more disturbing was taking shape, something that would not explode, not collapse overnight, but slowly seep into bodies, soil, and memory. Humberstone was not born as a ghost town. It was engineered, designed, planned with precision in the late 19th century to extract one of the most valuable resources of its time, natural nitrate, known as saltpeter. This white mineral fueled agriculture across the world and fed the global demand for explosives. Entire economies depended on it. Nations grew rich because of it. And in the middle of the desert, companies decided to build a city around its extraction, confident that technology and discipline could tame nature itself. At first, everything seemed to confirm that belief. Humberstone had electricity when nearby regions did not. It had a theater, a swimming pool, schools, churches, and social clubs. Workers arrived with their families, convinced they were stepping into a future of stability. The desert, hostile and endless, was pushed back by rail lines, machines, and rigid schedules. Life followed the rhythm of the factory sirens. Order replaced chaos. Progress replaced fear. But progress has a cost, and in Humberstone, that cost was never written into contracts or spoken out loud. The extraction and processing of nitrate required constant exposure to chemicals, dust, and residues that settled everywhere. On clothes, on furniture, on skin, in lungs. The desert winds did not carry the waste away. They spread it. Fine particles clung to walls, seeped into the ground, and accumulated year after year, invisible, normalized, ignored. No alarms rang. No dramatic disaster forced evacuation. Instead, contamination became part of daily life, so familiar that it stopped being questioned. Children played near industrial zones. Families cooked with water drawn from compromised sources. Workers returned home covered in residues that followed them inside. The city functioned perfectly on the surface, while something toxic embedded itself deeper with every passing day. Humberstone's isolation made this easier to ignore. Far from major cities, far from regulators, far from scrutiny, the company controlled not only labor but information. Complaints were minimized. Illnesses were treated as individual misfortune, not as patterns. The desert, vast and empty, swallowed evidence quickly. When someone left, another worker arrived. When a family moved away, another took its place. The machine never stopped. What makes Humberstone unsettling is not just that it was abandoned, but how quietly it died. When synthetic nitrates entered the market in the 20th century, the global demand collapsed almost overnight. What had once been priceless became obsolete. The same industrial system that had justified the city now rendered it useless. Jobs vanished. Investment stopped. Maintenance ended. And suddenly, the desert began to reclaim what industry had carved into it. People left, in waves, carrying what they could, abandoning what they could not. Houses were locked and never reopened. Schools closed mid-semester. Theaters went dark, but the contamination did not leave with them. It stayed, in the soil, in the structures, in the dust that still rises when the wind cuts through empty streets. Today, Humberstone stands preserved, almost frozen in time. Declared a World Heritage Site, it attracts visitors from around the world. Tourists walk through homes, sit in old classrooms, photograph rusted machinery, often unaware that this is not just a historical ruin, but a contaminated landscape. Few realize that the same substances that sustained the city may still pose risks decades later. This is not just the story of a ghost town. It is the story of how industrial ambition can normalize danger, how contamination does not always announce itself with catastrophe, and how entire populations can live, work, and raise families inside environments that are quietly harming them. Humberstone forces an uncomfortable question. How many other places followed the same path, thriving visibly while deteriorating invisibly? And as we look closer at how Humberstone truly functioned day to day, the routines, the labor, and the lives built around this industry, the hidden cost of that apparent order becomes impossible to ignore. If this story is already making you look at abandoned cities differently, take a moment to pause and reflect on what Humberstone really represents. Entire families lived here, believing they were building a future, without knowing what was slowly building inside their own bodies and around their homes. This kind of history only stays alive when people are willing to understand it, question it, and talk about it. Leave a comment below sharing what shocked you most so far about Humberstone, or write the word Humberstone if this is the first time you're hearing about this place. Your comments help keep these hidden stories visible and push this investigation further. If you believe this kind of deep historical investigation matters, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because the next part of this story goes even deeper into what daily life in Humberstone really meant for those who had no choice but to stay. Before Humberstone became a ghost town associated with contamination and abandonment, it was presented to the world as a model of modern industrial civilization. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this settlement in northern Chile was not seen as remote or dangerous, but as advanced, disciplined, and unusually organized for such a hostile environment. In the middle of the Atacama Desert, where rainfall was almost non-existent and survival itself seemed unlikely, Humberstone appeared to defy geography. That illusion of control was precisely what made it so powerful and so deceptive. The city was built around the saltpeter industry, at a time when natural nitrate was one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. It fertilized crops across Europe and North America and powered the production of explosives that fed both mining and warfare. Countries depended on it. Corporations competed for it. Humberstone existed because global markets demanded it, and because companies believed that with enough structure, machinery, and authority, even the desert could be turned into a permanent source of wealth. From the outside, Humberstone looked like proof that they were right. The town was carefully planned, with clear divisions between industrial zones, residential areas, and social spaces. There were schools for children, a theater for entertainment, sports fields, churches, and community halls. Electricity arrived early. Clean uniforms, strict schedules, and company rules created the impression of order and stability. For many workers coming from poverty and other regions, Humberstone felt like an opportunity they could not refuse. Families arrived, believing they were stepping into progress. Housing was provided. Food was subsidized. Medical attention existed, at least in basic form. The company controlled almost everything, but that control was presented as protection. In exchange for obedience and labor, workers received a structured life in a place where chaos could have easily taken over. The desert outside the town was unforgiving, but inside, Humberstone offered predictability, routine, and the promise of upward mobility. What was rarely discussed was how fragile this model truly was. Humberstone depended entirely on a single resource and a single industry. There was no alternative economy, no diversification, no long-term plan beyond continued extraction. The town existed as long as saltpeter was profitable, and only as long as global demand justified the cost of maintaining such an isolated operation. Everything else, schools, culture, community, was secondary to production. Daily life revolved around the factory. Sirens dictated when people woke, worked, ate, and rested. The rhythm of the machines shaped human existence. Men spent long hours processing nitrate under harsh conditions, surrounded by dust, chemical residues, and extreme temperatures. Women managed households that were constantly infiltrated by the byproducts of that labor. Children grew up seeing the factory not as a danger, but as the center of life itself. The company narrative emphasized pride. Workers were told they were part of something important, something that fed nations and fueled progress. That narrative helped suppress doubt. When people became ill, it was framed as weakness or bad luck. When accidents happened, they were treated as isolated incidents. The idea that the environment itself might be harmful was almost unthinkable because it would challenge the entire foundation of the town's existence. Humberstone was also socially isolated by design. Distance from major cities made leaving difficult. Transportation was limited. The desert acted as a natural barrier, reinforcing dependence on the company for survival. This isolation reduced oversight and allowed practices that would have been questioned elsewhere to continue unquestioned. There were no journalists, no inspectors, no independent institutions regularly observing what was happening. At its peak, Humberstone was not seen as a place of suffering, but as a success story. Photographs from the period show smiling families, public celebrations, sports teams, and cultural events. These images were real, but incomplete. They captured moments of human resilience without revealing the invisible conditions surrounding them. A city can look alive while slowly undermining the health of everyone inside it. This is what makes Humberstone's later fate so unsettling. It was not a failed town from the beginning. It worked exactly as intended. It produced wealth, maintained order, and sustained a population for decades. The danger was never dramatic enough to provoke rebellion or mass departure. Instead, it blended into daily life, normalized by routine, and reinforced by economic necessity. Understanding Humberstone before its collapse is essential, because it explains why so many people stayed, trusted the system, and built their lives there. It also reveals how easily progress can become a trap when it is built on a single promise and surrounded by silence. The very structure that made Humberstone feel safe and modern is what prevented its inhabitants from recognizing the risks accumulating around them. And once we look closer at the industry itself, the extraction process, the chemicals involved, and the working conditions inside the nitrate plants, the invisible danger that shaped this city becomes far more difficult to dismiss. The real danger of Humberstone did not come from a single explosion, a visible leak, or a moment of collapse. It came from the process itself, repeated every day, year after year, until contamination became inseparable from normal life. To understand why this town became one of the most contaminated ghost cities in South America, it is necessary to look closely at how saltpeter was extracted and processed, and how deeply those methods shaped the environment and the human body. Natural nitrate was not simply collected from the ground. It was industrially processed through a complex system that involved crushing caliche rock, heating it, dissolving it in water, and separating the nitrate through chemical reactions. This process generated enormous amounts of waste. Sludge, dust, chemical residues, and mineral byproducts accumulated constantly. There were no modern containment systems, no environmental regulations, and no understanding of long-term toxicity. Waste was dumped nearby, reused casually, or simply left to settle wherever gravity and wind carried it. Fine nitrate dust filled the air. Workers inhaled it during long shifts, their lungs absorbing particles day after day. The Atacama Desert, often imagined as clean and sterile, became a perfect trap. With almost no rain to wash contaminants away, residues remained suspended in soil and structures. Windstorms lifted fine particles and spread them across homes, schools, and public spaces. What was produced inside the plant never stayed inside the plant. Water, already scarce, was another vector of contamination. Industrial processes demanded large quantities of water, which was often recycled and reused with minimal treatment. Wells and storage systems became compromised over time. Families cooked, washed, and drank from sources that had been in constant contact with industrial residues. The lack of visible immediate effects reinforced the illusion that everything was safe. Workers handled materials with little protection. Masks, gloves, and safety protocols were minimal or non-existent. Chemical burns, respiratory irritation, and chronic fatigue were common but normalized. If a man could still work, he worked. If he could not, he was replaced. The labor system was designed for continuity, not care. Illness was treated as a personal failure rather than an environmental consequence. Inside homes, contamination followed the workers. Dust settled on floors, furniture, and bedding. Clothes brought residues from the plant into living spaces. Children grew up crawling on contaminated surfaces, breathing air that carried invisible particles. Over time, exposure became multi-generational. Even those who never worked in the nitrate facilities absorbed the consequences of living near them. What makes Humberstone particularly disturbing is that none of this was hidden. It was visible, tangible, and constant. Piles of industrial waste stood near residential areas. Machinery leaked fluids. Smoke and vapor rose from processing zones. But because these conditions were permanent, they stopped being noticed. Danger loses its power when it becomes routine. Medical knowledge at the time did not connect chronic exposure to long-term disease in a clear way. Respiratory illnesses, skin problems, digestive issues, and unexplained weakness were treated symptom by symptom. There was no framework to identify a pattern, no authority willing to question the industry that sustained the town. Without that lens, contamination remained an abstract concept, not a threat demanding action. The desert environment amplified everything. In wetter regions, contamination can disperse or dilute over time. In the Atacama, it accumulates. The soil becomes a record. Walls absorb residues. Wooden structures trap dust. Metal corrodes under chemical exposure. Decades later, traces of nitrate processing are still detectable in Humberstone's buildings and ground. The town did not simply stop operating. It became a reservoir of industrial history and industrial poison. As long as saltpeter remained profitable, this reality was tolerated. Economic dependence silenced concern. Families stayed because leaving meant unemployment, displacement, and uncertainty. The company provided housing, food access, and social life. To challenge the system was to challenge survival itself. This is how contamination becomes systemic. Not through secrecy, but through necessity. Humberstone did not poison its population in one dramatic act. It did so gradually, quietly, through a structure that rewarded endurance and punished questioning. By the time the industry collapsed, the damage was already embedded in the land and in the people who had spent their lives there. Understanding this process changes how Humberstone should be seen. It was not simply abandoned because it became economically irrelevant. It was left behind, carrying the physical imprint of decades of unregulated industrial exposure. And when the workers finally left, the contamination remained as the most persistent resident of all. Daily life in Humberstone unfolded inside a contradiction. On one side, there was structure, routine, and a sense of belonging that many workers had never known before. On the other, there was exhaustion, exposure, and a slow physical toll that rarely received a name. Families woke to factory sirens that sliced through the desert silence. Children prepared for school while fathers dressed for shifts that would last 10 or 12 hours under an unforgiving sun. Mothers organized homes that were always fighting dust, heat, and scarcity. Everything moved according to the schedule of production. For workers inside the nitrate plant, the day began with proximity to machines that dominated every sense. The sound of crushing rock, the heat from boiling solutions, the sharp smell of chemicals that lingered in the air long after a shift ended. Caliche dust coated skin and hair. Sweat mixed with residues and dried into a thin crust by midday. Breaks were short. Hydration was limited. The desert offered no relief, only more exposure. When the siren signaled the end of a shift, the work did not truly stop. Men walked home carrying the factory with them, on their clothes, in their lungs, in their fatigue. Inside small wooden houses, wives shook out garments that released clouds of fine dust into living spaces. Floors were swept constantly, yet never truly clean. Water was rationed, so washing thoroughly was often impossible. What could not be removed simply became part of the household environment. Children experienced Humberstone differently. For them, the town was normal. The factory was not a threat, but a landmark. The waste piles were places to explore. Rusted machinery became playgrounds. Dust storms were interruptions, not warnings. Schools taught discipline, literacy, and pride in work, reinforcing the idea that the industry sustained everything worth protecting. Few adults questioned letting children roam freely because there was nowhere else to go. Social life offered brief escapes from labor. The theater hosted performances, sports, fields filled with teams competing under desert skies. Festivals and holidays were celebrated with music and shared meals. These moments mattered. They created bonds and memories that made the town feel alive. They also helped normalize the environment. When laughter echoes through contaminated streets, danger feels distant and abstract. Health problems were present, but fragmented. A persistent cough here, skin lesions there, chronic weakness that never fully disappeared. Doctors treated symptoms with limited tools and limited understanding. Respiratory irritation was expected. Fatigue was part of the job. Illness became individualized, never connected to a broader cause. When someone could no longer work, they were replaced quietly. The system absorbed loss without changing course. Women carried a different burden. Managing households meant constant exposure without recognition. Cooking with compromised water. Cleaning surfaces that trapped residues. Caring for sick children, while maintaining appearances of order. Their labor kept families functioning, but rarely entered official records. The contamination they absorbed was invisible and uncounted, yet persistent. The desert amplified isolation. Leaving Humberstone required resources most families did not have. Transportation was limited. Employment elsewhere was uncertain. Remaining meant stability, however fragile. This calculation shaped daily decisions. Endurance became a virtue. Questioning became a risk. The community adapted not by resisting conditions, but by absorbing them. Over time, the body learned to tolerate what it could not escape. Symptoms blended into routine. The absence of immediate catastrophe reassured people that nothing was fundamentally wrong. Life continued. Children grew up. New families arrived. The town maintained its rhythm, even as exposure accumulated silently across years. This is what makes Humberstone unsettling beyond its ruins. It was not a place of constant suffering. It was a place where ordinary life unfolded inside extraordinary conditions. People married, celebrated, argued, and hoped, all while living within an environment that slowly undermined their health. The danger did not announce itself. It waited. When the industry finally collapsed and people were forced to leave, many carried more than memories with them. The effects of long-term exposure did not stop at the edge of the desert. They followed former residents into new towns, new jobs, and new lives, often without explanation. Looking at Humberstone today, it is easy to focus on abandoned buildings and rusted machines. Harder is to imagine the daily routines that once filled these spaces, routines shaped by necessity and trust, in a system that offered stability while quietly extracting a hidden cost. Humberstone did not collapse the way most people imagine industrial towns collapsing. There was no explosion that shattered buildings, no single accident that forced an emergency evacuation, no dramatic announcement that the city was finished. Instead, the end arrived quietly, carried not by contamination, but by economics. And that quiet ending is what made everything that remained behind even more disturbing. For decades, Humberstone existed because natural nitrate was essential to the modern world. Agriculture depended on it. Explosives depended on it. Entire national economies were shaped by it. But science does not respect tradition, and by the early 20th century, chemists in Europe had found a way to synthesize nitrate artificially. The Haber-Bosch process changed everything. Suddenly, what had once been extracted with enormous effort from desert rock could be produced in laboratories and factories, faster, cheaper, and closer to consumers. The global market reacted brutally. Prices collapsed, demand evaporated, contracts were canceled. For Humberstone, this was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden loss of purpose. The same industrial logic that had justified building a city in the middle of the Atacama now justified abandoning it just as efficiently. Machinery slowed, then stopped. Maintenance budgets were cut. Wages became irregular. Investment disappeared almost overnight. The infrastructure that had been carefully maintained for decades began to deteriorate rapidly under desert conditions. Without constant care, metal corroded, wood cracked, and systems failed. The town that had functioned like a machine began to break down piece by piece. Workers were given little warning. Some were told their shifts were suspended. Others learned through rumors. Families waited for official instructions that never fully came. The company, facing its own collapse, focused on minimizing losses, not on managing human consequences. There was no long-term relocation plan, no comprehensive support system. People were expected to leave because the town no longer made sense economically. Evacuation happened in waves, not in a single moment. Those with savings or connections left first. They packed essentials, sold what they could, and boarded trains toward uncertain futures. Others stayed, hoping the industry might recover, that demand would return, that the town could be revived. It never was. As families left, homes were sealed hastily or abandoned entirely. Furniture remained in place. Personal belongings were left behind. Schools closed with books still on desks. Shops shut their doors with inventory, untouched. The theater curtains fell for the last time. The town emptied, not because it was unlivable, but because it was no longer profitable. What makes this abandonment especially unsettling is that contamination played no role in the decision to leave. The soil was already compromised. The buildings were already saturated with industrial residues. But that reality was irrelevant to the company and largely invisible to the workers. People left because the jobs were gone, not because the environment was dangerous. This meant that Humberstone was abandoned in a state of suspended toxicity. The industrial processes stopped, but their byproducts did not. Waste piles remained. Dust settled into structures. Chemical residues stayed embedded in walls and ground. With no population to disturb them, contaminants became stable, preserved by the same arid climate that had once enabled industrial efficiency. The desert sealed the town like a capsule, without rain to wash surfaces clean, and without human activity to disperse materials. Everything stayed exactly where it was. Over time, Humberstone became less a city and more a preserved industrial ecosystem, frozen at the moment when production ceased. Former residents carried their lives elsewhere, often without understanding what they had left behind or what they had been exposed to. Many remembered Humberstone with nostalgia. It had been home. It had offered stability. It had shaped their identity. Few thought of it as a toxic place, because toxicity had never been part of the narrative. For the companies involved, Humberstone became an asset written off, a chapter closed. For the region, it became a scar, visible but unexplained. And for history, it became a ghost town whose danger lay not in collapse or decay, but in what remained intact. This moment, the quiet transition from living city to abandoned shell, is what transformed Humberstone into something far more complex than a failed industrial settlement. It became a site where human life, economic logic, and environmental damage were severed from each other, leaving behind a place that looked harmless, even picturesque, while holding the residue of everything that had once sustained it. When people return today and walk through intact streets and well-preserved buildings, they often assume the town is safe because it looks stable. But stability is exactly what allows contamination to persist undisturbed. And that is where Humberstone's story becomes more dangerous, not less. If abandonment did not remove the risk, then what exactly was left behind, and how long can it continue to affect those who enter this silent city? The abandonment of Humberstone was not a clean departure. It was not organized, controlled, or carefully documented. It was forced by circumstance and driven by urgency, leaving behind a population that had to disappear quickly from a place that could no longer sustain them. This sudden withdrawal created a second tragedy layered on top of the first because people did not simply leave their jobs behind. They left their lives suspended in mid-motion. Families were given little time to prepare. Notices were vague. Some workers were told the plant would close temporarily. Others were informed that operations were suspended indefinitely. Very few understood that this meant the end. As a result, many households delayed departure until it was too late to leave with dignity. Trains became crowded. Transport options shrank. Panic spread quietly, without headlines or protests. Homes were abandoned in stages. First, non-essential belongings. Then furniture too heavy to carry. Finally, entire houses left sealed or simply walked away from. Photographs remained on walls. Clothes stayed in drawers. Toys lay scattered in rooms that would never again hear children's voices. Humberstone did not empty all at once. It thinned out, slowly and unevenly, until silence replaced routine. The company did not conduct environmental cleanup. There was no decontamination process, no assessment of industrial residues, no effort to secure hazardous areas. Once the workforce was gone, the town no longer represented an economic responsibility. The land was written off. The buildings were locked or left open to the desert. The toxic elements embedded in the soil and structures were ignored because no one was officially meant to live there anymore. Former residents scattered across northern Chile and beyond. Some found work in other nitrate towns that were themselves already declining. Others moved to cities, carrying memories of Humberstone as a place of discipline and order, not danger. Many never spoke about the conditions they had lived under. Their departure was treated as an economic migration, not as displacement from a compromised environment. This silence had consequences. Because Humberstone was abandoned rather than destroyed, it remained visually intact. Streets stayed in place. Houses stood upright. Public buildings did not collapse. To outsiders, it looked like a town frozen in time, not a contaminated site. The absence of visible ruin made it easier to forget what had happened there and why. Nature did not reclaim Humberstone quickly. The desert does not erase, it preserves. Without rain, plant growth, or microbial activity to break materials down, industrial residues remained exactly where they had been left. The same conditions that had once supported extraction now protected contamination from decay. Over time, scavengers, explorers, and later tourists began to enter the town. Doors were forced open, windows were broken. Dust was disturbed. What had been sealed by abandonment was slowly reintroduced into the air. Yet no warnings accompanied this renewed access. Humberstone was treated as a historical curiosity, not as a hazardous environment. For the people who were forced to leave, the trauma was complex. They lost community, identity, and stability at once. Some remembered Humberstone with affection, focusing on friendships and shared routines. Others carried resentment, but lacked language to explain it. The idea that the town itself might have harmed them was rarely discussed, even decades later. This is the quiet violence of abandonment. When a city dies without acknowledgement, responsibility dissolves. No one is held accountable for what remains behind. The population disperses. Records are lost. Contamination becomes anonymous. Humberstone did not become dangerous after people left. It was dangerous long before. But abandonment stripped away witnesses, and without witnesses, risk becomes invisible. That invisibility is what allowed Humberstone to survive not as a warning, but as a monument. And once the town was officially empty, a new question emerged, one that would not be addressed for decades. What exactly was left behind in the soil, the walls, and the air, and how dangerous was it really? What remained in Humberstone after the last families left was not emptiness. It was residue. Layers of material that did not belong to the desert and were never meant to stay exposed for decades. Once human activity stopped, these substances did not disappear. They settled, bonded to surfaces, and became part of the town's physical structure. Humberstone turned into a silent archive of industrial contamination, preserved by one of the driest climates on the planet. The soil around the nitrate works absorbed years of waste. Processing. Caliche rock released compounds rich in nitrates, sulfates, and heavy mineral residues. Without containment systems, runoff flowed directly into surrounding ground. Over time, these substances crystallized into the soil itself. In wetter environments, chemical traces might leach away or break down. In the Atacama, they remain almost unchanged, locked in place by the absence of rain. Buildings absorbed contamination as well. Wooden walls trapped fine dust. Porous materials like plaster and adobe held chemical particles deep within their structure. Floors accumulated layers of residue carried in on boots and clothing. Even metal surfaces show corrosion patterns consistent with prolonged chemical exposure. Humberstone does not just display industrial ruins. It retains the chemistry of its past. Airborne risk never fully vanished. The desert wind still moves through the town, lifting fine dust from the ground and surfaces. Each gust reactivates particles that have been dormant for decades. Visitors often describe the air as dry and clean, but that dryness is precisely what allows contaminants to become airborne so easily. Without moisture to bind particles, dust travels freely. Scientific studies conducted in similar former nitrate towns have identified elevated concentrations of heavy metals and industrial byproducts in soil and structures. While Humberstone itself has been partially studied, comprehensive remediation has never occurred. The designation as a heritage site preserved architecture, not environmental safety. Preservation froze the town visually, not chemically. This creates a dangerous illusion. Because the buildings are stable and the streets intact, people assume the environment is neutral. But contamination does not announce itself with warning signs or visible decay. It exists quietly, detectable only through analysis or long-term exposure. Touching walls, sitting on surfaces, breathing dust, all of it carries potential risk that few visitors consider. The danger is not immediate poisoning. It is cumulative exposure, the kind that affects lungs, skin, and internal systems over repeated contact. For former residents, that exposure lasted years. For tourists and explorers, it may be brief, but repeated visits or unprotected exploration increases risk over time. What makes Humberstone especially unsettling is that its contamination is invisible to the casual observer, but persistent enough to matter. It is not a place cleansed by abandonment. It is a place preserved in chemical stasis. The desert protects what should have been addressed, allowing risk to outlive the people who created it. There are no clear warning markers throughout the site, no protective requirements for visitors, no barriers around areas most heavily affected by industrial activity. The town is treated as a cultural artifact, not an environmental hazard. That disconnect between appearance and reality is where the danger lies. Humberstone forces a difficult realization. Some ghost towns are empty because life became impossible. Others are empty because they became unnecessary. Humberstone belongs to the second category. It was abandoned while still structurally sound, leaving contamination intact and unchallenged. Its danger is not collapse, but preservation. As interest in abandoned places grows, photographers, historians, and travelers continue to enter spaces like this, often without understanding what they are disturbing. Every step lifts dust. Every opened door releases particles trapped for decades. The town does not resist, it invites. And when people begin to ask whether Humberstone is safe to visit today, the answer is far more complicated than most expect, because safety depends not on how the town looks, but on what it still carries. For many years, the human cost of Humberstone remained fragmented and largely unspoken. There were no official investigations connecting illness to environment, no public reckoning, no moment when authorities acknowledged that an entire population had lived inside a compromised industrial landscape. What existed instead were stories, scattered, personal, often dismissed. Accounts of sickness that never fully healed, of bodies that weakened too early, of patterns that only became visible long after people had left the desert. Former residents recalled persistent respiratory problems that followed them for life. Chronic coughing, shortness of breath, recurring infections that doctors treated without understanding their origin, skin conditions that never responded properly to treatment, digestive disorders that appeared suddenly and became permanent. At the time, these symptoms were explained away as consequences of hard labor, desert climate, or personal weakness. The idea that the town itself was a factor rarely entered the conversation. Children who grew up in Humberstone carried their own invisible burden. Some developed health issues years later, far from the nitrate works, long after exposure had ended. Because these effects appeared gradually and without dramatic onset, they were never connected back to childhood environments. Medical records followed individuals, not places. Patterns dissolved into statistics that never formed a story. What makes this especially troubling is that nitrate processing environments elsewhere in the world have been linked to increased rates of respiratory disease, chemical irritation, and long-term exposure effects. In Humberstone, similar conditions existed, but without oversight, monitoring, or documentation. The absence of data did not mean the absence of harm. It meant the harm went uncounted. There were also sudden deaths that raised quiet questions. Workers collapsing on the job, men who deteriorated rapidly without clear diagnosis. These incidents were treated as isolated tragedies, not symptoms of systemic exposure. In an economy built on replacement, individual loss did not slow production. The system absorbed human cost without adjusting behavior. Women, once again, were largely invisible in these accounts. Their exposure came through domestic labor, water use, dust accumulation, and caregiving. When illness appeared, it was framed as unrelated to work because their labor was never officially acknowledged as part of the industrial process. Their health experiences were personal, not industrial, and therefore easier to ignore. Even after Humberstone was abandoned, its legacy followed. Former residents. Some communities that absorbed these displaced families noticed patterns of poor health among former nitrate workers. But without records, without institutional memory, and without a single authority responsible, nothing was formally traced back to the town. Humberstone faded into nostalgia, not accountability. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the story. Contamination did not only poison soil and buildings, it fragmented memory. Without documentation, harm became anecdotal. Without recognition, suffering became private. And without a narrative linking environment to consequence, responsibility dissolved completely. Today, when historians focus on Humberstone, they often emphasize architecture, industrial innovation, and cultural life. These elements are real and important, but they sit on top of a quieter layer of history, one made of unrecorded illnesses, shortened lives, and unanswered questions. A city can be celebrated while its human cost remains unresolved. The absence of official acknowledgement does not mean the absence of truth. It means that the truth exists in fragments, carried by families, remembered in conversations, hinted at in medical histories that never quite make sense. Humberstone did not just contaminate a place, it contaminated the ability to fully understand what happened there. And this unresolved human legacy becomes even more uncomfortable when the town re-enters public life, not as a warning, but as a destination. Because once a place marked by silent harm becomes a tourist attraction, a new question emerges. Is the danger truly over, or has it simply changed shape? When Humberstone reopened to the world, it did not do so as a contaminated site or a place of caution. It returned as a destination. Declared a World Heritage Site, it was reframed as a cultural treasure, a preserved industrial city frozen in time. Tourists began arriving from across Chile and from other countries, cameras in hand, drawn by the haunting beauty of abandoned streets and perfectly still buildings. What few of them realized was that the very preservation that made Humberstone so visually striking also preserved the conditions that made it dangerous. Visitors walk through homes, schools, and industrial zones with little restriction. They touch walls, sit on benches, lean against railings, and breathe air thick with dust stirred by footsteps. The dryness of the desert gives a false sense of cleanliness. There is no smell, no moisture, no visible decay that signals risk. But dust is the primary carrier of contamination here, and every movement reactivates it. Unlike sites officially classified as hazardous, Humberstone offers few warnings. There are signs explaining history, architecture, and daily life, but almost none addressing environmental exposure. Protective gear is not required, masks are not recommended, time limits are not enforced. The narrative presented to the public focuses on nostalgia and heritage, not on what remains embedded in the environment. This creates a dangerous gap between perception and reality. Tourists assume that if a site is open to the public, it must be safe. Heritage status implies protection, care, and oversight. But preservation of structures is not the same as remediation of contamination. One protects appearances, the other addresses risk. In Humberstone, only the first has occurred. The danger is subtle and cumulative. A brief visit may pose limited risk, but repeated exposure, extended exploration, or unprotected entry into industrial zones increases the chance of inhaling or contacting residues that have not degraded with time. Urban explorers, photographers, and researchers who spend hours inside buildings are particularly vulnerable, especially when they disturb dust trapped for decades. There is also a broader ethical issue. By promoting Humberstone as a tourist attraction without fully acknowledging its contamination, authorities unintentionally encourage behavior that would be restricted elsewhere. Visitors are invited to experience history, but not informed about its lingering consequences. This transforms a site of industrial harm into a spectacle rather than a lesson. For former residents and their descendants, this transformation can feel unsettling. The place where people lived, worked, and suffered quietly is now consumed visually, stripped of context. The risks they absorbed daily are now treated as background, scenery. The absence of warnings reinforces the idea that nothing serious ever happened there, that the town simply faded away. Humberstone's current status raises an uncomfortable question. When does preservation become denial? When a contaminated site is cleaned, restricted, or clearly marked, danger is acknowledged. When it is aestheticized instead, danger is softened, made invisible. Humberstone sits in that gray zone, safe enough to visit, unsafe enough to matter, and ambiguous enough to avoid accountability. This ambiguity allows the town to exist in two realities at once, one as a beautiful relic of industrial ambition, the other as a place where contamination still lingers in dust and walls. Most visitors see only the first. The second remains unspoken. And that silence matters, because Humberstone is not unique. It represents a broader pattern of progress built quickly, abandoned quietly, and remembered selectively. The way we choose to frame this town determines whether it serves as a warning or as a romanticized ruin, which leads to the final and most uncomfortable realization. Humberstone is not just a ghost town. It is a symbol of how entire communities can be sacrificed for progress, then preserved without confronting the damage left behind. Humberstone is often described as a relic of another era, a frozen image of industrial ambition left behind by time. But that description is too comfortable, too distant. What Humberstone really represents is a pattern that repeats itself across history, across continents, and across industries. It is the story of how progress is built quickly, how risk is normalized quietly, and how entire communities can be discarded once they stop being useful. The town was never meant to last beyond its economic function. Every house, every school, every theater existed because production demanded a workforce that could remain stable in an extreme environment. Once production lost its value, the justification for human presence vanished. The same system that had created a sense of belonging dismantled it without ceremony. Humberstone was not abandoned because it failed socially. It was abandoned because it succeeded economically until it became obsolete. This is what makes Humberstone more than a ghost town. It is a reminder that industrial logic does not measure success in human terms. Health, longevity, and community are secondary to output and efficiency. As long as the system functions, the costs remain invisible. When it stops, those costs are left behind without resolution. The contamination embedded in Humberstone's soil and walls is not an accident. It is a byproduct of an era that prioritized extraction over foresight. The lack of cleanup is not an oversight. It is a consequence of abandonment without accountability. No company returned to remediate. No authority demanded restitution. The land was simply reclassified from productive to historical, skipping the uncomfortable step of reckoning with what had been done. Humberstone forces us to confront a difficult truth. Many of the places we admire as monuments of progress were built through exposure, sacrifice, and silence. The people who paid that price rarely appear in official narratives. Their illnesses are not archived. Their shortened lives are not counted. What remains are buildings, machinery, and carefully curated stories that focus on innovation rather than consequence. The desert preserves Humberstone, but preservation is not justice. Stability of structures does not mean closure of history. The absence of visible danger does not mean the danger is gone. Humberstone stands as a warning precisely because it looks intact. It invites us in, disarms suspicion, and asks us to admire what was built while distracting us from what was absorbed. This town also challenges how we remember places tied to harm. When sites like Humberstone are presented without their full context, they risk becoming symbols of nostalgia instead of lessons. The beauty of abandonment can overshadow the reality of contamination. Silence becomes part of the architecture, and Humberstone is not alone. Around the world, former mining towns, industrial settlements, and extraction hubs share similar stories. They rise fast, operate intensely, and disappear quietly. The land keeps the record even when people do not. Humberstone is simply one of the clearest examples because the desert refused to erase it. To understand, Humberstone fully is to understand that ghost towns are not always dead because they failed. Sometimes they are dead because they worked exactly as intended. They extracted value until there was nothing left to take, and then they were left behind with everything that could not be carried away. What remains is not just history, but responsibility. Responsibility to recognize patterns. Responsibility to question narratives of progress that ignore long-term harm. Responsibility to see ghost towns, not as curiosities, but as evidence. Humberstone does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. And understanding it means accepting that progress without accountability always leaves something behind, even when everyone else has moved on. If you stayed until the end of this story, It means you understand that Humberstone is more than an abandoned town. It is a warning written in dust, silence, and forgotten lives. Stories like this only matter if they are remembered, questioned, and shared. Take a moment to leave a comment below and write, "Humberstone was a warning." If this story changed the way you see ghost towns and industrial progress, your comment helps this investigation reach more people who need to hear it. If this kind of deep, unsettling history matters to you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That support is what allows these hidden stories to stay alive. And don't stop here. Watch the next video appearing on your screen now, because the next city we explore carries secrets that are just as disturbing and in some ways even harder to see.